All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is the daily vlog. I think it's 104. The reason I am, today, gonna do that. The reason I'm slightly confused on what the number is I'm actually recording this daily vlog early because I can right now. And I'm really worried that by tomorrow I'm going to be massively sick again because it's just how my brain works. And I can record it right now. I have an idea for a video right now, so I'm going to record it. And we will see. Maybe I just get an extra day to chillax and not do anything. Who knows? So, today. There was recently an interview that came out, and I can't even remember which member of the D&D team said it, because I only read like a glancing thing about it. But the interview is basically talking about 1D&D and, some of the things that people have learned is my understanding of it. And one of the quotes that's being shopped around the internet is the D&D team member said that they think that the original core book may be shipped with too many classes. And I've been seeing a lot of different kind of hot takes on it, and they have, stupid stuff like D&D is going to get rid of classes and all that. That's never what it was about. But it does bring up something that I think a lot of people don't understand about 5th edition to D&D. And this actually goes back to my experiences when I first started creating content for the DMs Guild and creating officially published D&D content. Each edition of D&D classes were a different beast. Like each iteration of D&D, they treat classes a little bit differently. In the original D&D, classes were basically based around how are you going to fight effectively, and they were meant to mimic certain kind of archetypes. So did you want to just use weapons and do cool stuff like that? You're a fighter. Did you want to cast spells and stuff like that? You're a magic user. Did you want to be real sneaky and everything? Well, you're a thief or a rogue. You get to 2nd edition and classes are starting to become a little bit more defined lore-wise, where it's not just how do you want to fight? Okay, pick this class. They start having histories and the things like that, but they want to keep some of that, well, how do you want to fight aspect? And so they had categories of classes in D&D 2nd edition. And you basically had 4 different, you had your priests, I want to say they were wizards, your fighters, and then your rogue, or I think they were called specialists at that point. So you had these 4 different kind of categories of classes, and then you had all the different classes. And once you started playing around with kits and things a little like that, you really could create some really interesting, unique things. And then if you did multi-classing, or what was it called, split classing, or whatever humans could do, there were some pretty interesting things. But again, you were starting to get more into the classes are based on lore than it was the classes are based on how do you fight. You get to 3rd edition, and classes started being very heavily influenced by lore, but the classes themselves in 3rd edition were a little bit more of a collection of abilities that had a lore connection to them. Again, in 3rd edition, you were effectively required to multi-class. You really couldn't stay a single class all the way through to level 20 or level 30 if you got into the really high advanced stuff. Because the classes really stopped getting new abilities after around level 12. And after around level 8 or 9, the new abilities really weren't that spectacular. So 3rd edition was not only built with the idea that you were going to be multi-classing, but they had specific classes that were built around the idea of you couldn't take these. You had to multi-class into them. You couldn't take them at character creation. Those were prestige classes. And so if you were creating a new class in the 3rd edition, you were expected to kind of think of, okay, well, how is this going to synergize with other classes? Because again, you were meant to multi-class. And each class was really more of like a bit of an origin lore story plus some mechanics baked into it. Like a lot of classes would get certain feats for free, or they would have certain benefits that would mimic other FIFA feats, and that was 3rd edition class design. When you get to 4th edition, they wanted to kind of revert back to the idea of, okay, your classes are going to kind of dictate, or are going to kind of be dictated at how do you want to interact with the battlefield. And so they created the, I can't remember what it was called, but they created the 4 different types of classes. So you had defenders, you had leaders, you had strikers, and you had controllers. So they still had that, but then each class would have, and each one of those things would have a gimmick built into it. Defenders had the ability to mark in some way, shape, or form. And each different defender would have a different variation on how marking worked. Like your standard fighter would mark anytime they hit somebody with an attack, whereas a sword mage actually had an ability that allowed them to choose a mark. Things like that. And so that was... so in 4th edition class design, when you were creating a new class, you need to pick one of these 4 types of classes, defender, control, and then you had to take the kind of gimmick built into that and figure out a new way to develop it. And if you couldn't do that, then you really didn't need to make a new class. A lot of times you would just make new powers or something for an existing class to get them out of it. If there was already a class that did something similar to what you did, then you would just create new powers for them and allow them to kind of specialize that way. Move forward to 5th edition class design. I said this over as part of my shtick when I did D&D Deep Dive. In 5th edition, one of the bits of advice that I was given when I first sent out the Dragon Knight, which was my first custom class for 5th edition, it's still, I think, a fantastic class. I'm considering when D&D 5.5 comes out, I'm considering creating an update for it to make it gel a little bit better with whatever they change in 5.5. But I'm still very proud of it. And I think it's a fantastic class. I sent it off to a friend of mine to get some FIFA feedback, and they gave me some really, really good feedback because they were a playtester for Wizards of the Coast. They got stuff before Unearthed Arcana. And I think they still do. I actually don't know. But I know for years they were an official playtester for Wizards of the Coast. And they got to playtest a lot of the Adventures League adventures back when Wizards of the Coast actually kind of worked on writing them instead of just kind of licensing them out to other people. They would playtest those. I think they playtested a few of the hardcover books too. So anyway, the advice that they gave me was every class in D&D 5th edition is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. That was one of the worst parts of D&D 3rd edition, 2nd edition, 1st edition, and original D&D. Well, I guess original D&D wasn't because there weren't that many classes. But once you got to 1st edition Advanced D&D, 2nd edition, and definitely 3rd edition, all of your martial classes played the exact same way until around level 3 to 5. So your first few levels, it was the exact same thing. Same thing with all the caster classes, is they played the exact same way until around level 3 to 5. And so playing low level D&D was really, really kind of boring, because even if everybody picked a different class, you were all going to be doing the same thing, at least at the beginning. So, 4th edition solved this by the power system and all that stuff. Like, all the classes played very, very differently right from level 1, and I still love 4th edition. 5th edition, however, they took a slightly different approach. So every class in 5th edition was designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. And in order to do that, every class had these things that I used to refer to them as defining features, and I still do. And so basically, each class had a defining feature, and it meant that that class was going to play differently than any other class because of that defining feature. And a thing about a defining feature is it needed to show up in the class within the first 2 levels. And my first version of the Dragon Knight did not have the quote-unquote defining features showing up until level 3 when you chose your subclass. I eventually modified it to have you choose your subclass at first level, and that allowed me, because effectively what would happen is part of choosing your subclass for the Dragon Knight is you get a special weapon that you can make. Like the Dragoon had the winged spear, the Warblade had the dual blade, or double blade, I think it was. The Defender, the Dragon Defender had paired shields. And so what it was is you would take a mundane weapon, you'd spend an hour concentrating on it, and it would transform into your cool special dragon weapon. But up until 3rd level, you couldn't use your dragon weapon because you wouldn't get it until you chose your subclass. So all I did was, you were still using effectively that weapon. You were just using the mundane version of it for a couple levels. And all I did is I switched it to, you can get your dragon weapon right at level 1. It didn't really change much of anything. It just meant that I didn't have to play around with proficiencies and stuff like that. So anyway, getting back to 5th edition class design, what that meant was, and I think a lot of people didn't understand this, especially in the early days of the DM's Guild, where you would just get all of these new classes that were basically just, this is a fighter, but they also do this, or this is a wizard, but they also get, some abilities from the bard or something like that. And that's what a lot of people did, and they didn't understand that that's not how 5th edition class design works. Basically, every class is supposed to have a mechanic built into it that is completely unique, that doesn't work like any other class. That's the basics of 5th edition class design. If you had an idea for a class that was like, well, I want to play a fighter, but I want them to be a little bit different, then what you needed to do was create a subclass that allowed you to do that. But the defining features of each class were the kind of building blocks of D&D 5th edition. And when you look at the original, the original 11 classes that they had? I'm going to look it up before I say the wrong number. Or I might have already said the wrong number, but I'm actually going to look. So, the original classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So, they started off with 12 classes. And each one of those classes, to D&D's credit, play very differently. A barbarian feels very different than a fighter at level 1. Despite the fact that they're both martial classes, that they both are going to be basically using the attack action at level 1, a barbarian still feels very different than a fighter, and that still feels very different than a paladin. Same thing is true as wizards and sorcerers felt very different right from level 1. Clerics felt different too. Clerics and bards, all the full casters, all had different aspects that made them feel very, very different right from level 1. But what that also meant was if you wanted to introduce a new class, you needed that class to be able to do something that no other class already did. And that's one of the reasons why in the 10 years that D&D 5th edition has existed, they have only introduced one other official class, which is the Artificer. And the reason behind that is everything else is pretty well covered. Think of any class that existed in previous editions of D&D. Every prestige class, everything. You can recreate that class somewhere within the classes that already exist simply by using a subclass. And I would venture far enough to go, there really isn't that many just like fantasy-based tabletop RPG classes that you can't recreate in D&D 5th edition using a combination of subclasses and feats. Like you really, aside from a few things, you really don't need to create things. Now, that being said, I did create 2 new classes. And Matt Mercer created a new class, the Blood Hunter. And the Blood Hunter, right from level 1, plays very, very differently from the rest of them. But the longer D&D 5th edition existed, the less chance there was for you to be able to create new classes in that, because, again, the core design behind D&D 5th edition is you're not supposed to have 2 classes where you go, well, this is just like the divine version of this class. In previous editions, that was something that happened constantly. You know, it's like, well, this is the primal version of this class, or, you know, this is the arcane version of this class. That was an extremely common thing. 5th edition wanted to do away with that because rules bloat was real bad for 3.5. Rules bloat got real bad for 4th edition. They wanted to avoid rules bloat, and they wanted each class to feel special. When you look at D&D 3.5 near the end of it, there wasn't a whole lot of players that were really excited to play a basic fighter. It just, you know, there were so many other really cool classes that you could play that weren't the fighter. And so the original classes just got kind of thrown to the wayside. And then even people that did start with like a fighter or a paladin or something like that, the reason they were doing that is it would give them the collection of feats to get the real class that they wanted, the prestige class that they wanted. So it was kind of thrown away. 4th edition, again, once the more interesting classes like the Player's Handbook 2 and the Player's Handbook 3, there weren't a ton of people that were playing the original Player's Handbook classes. And then when they introduced the Essentials line of classes, those classes were even more unique and more interesting. They just really didn't work much past Tier 1, which most people only played in Tier 1. So it wasn't that big a deal, but... So yeah, they wanted to avoid that with D&D 5th edition. They wanted these classes to be important. So they built up the lore for them a lot more than most other D&D editions. They tried to have a really strong lore for every class and every subclass. And again, their entire purpose was to build around the idea of every class plays differently. If you have someone that's like, well, I want to play a fighter, but I want them to be more arcane focused, make that a subclass. You don't make an entire new class because they're going to effectively be sharing defining features. And we don't want that. Defining features are unique to each class. So when they talk about how, you know, I don't think we really should have had that many classes in the original core book, what I think they're referring to, and a really good example is the Ranger. The Ranger in the Player's Handbook was not a good class. It just 100% it wasn't. And I actually, there was a Reddit thread talking about the Ranger, and I actually posted this huge wall of text talking about the fact that the reason that the Ranger was so poorly designed and just didn't work very well in 5th edition was the Ranger, the concept for the Ranger was effectively a 3rd edition class, because the 4th edition version of the Ranger was not really well loved. It kind of had a similar problem where they took the 3rd edition version of the Ranger and then they tried to translate it to 5th edition, and 5th edition does not work like 3rd edition. 3rd edition was built around the idea of tiny piecemeal bonuses that eventually add up into something good. Everything about third edition is about these tiny little pieces that you add together to eventually create something interesting. Feats were all like really, really small incremental growth. Your level ups gave you small incremental growth. Everything that you did was these small little baby steps. Each time you leveled up, your skills would increase by 1 point. In general, you theoretically could spend it on other ones, but that meant that you weren't min-maxing, and therefore you were wrong. And so the Ranger was kind of built on this idea that the Ranger would get these kind of floating modifiers that helped it do really cool things, and it would have these little kind of increases to damage against certain creatures. And that's what the Ranger was built off of, was these tiny little incremental growth. Well, 5th edition, they threw out the idea of incremental growth. If you gained a level, you needed to feel good about it. If you took a feat, it should change how your character played the game. And there were no longer floating modifiers. So when they translated the Ranger from 3rd edition into 5th edition, you had a bunch of features, because they were focusing more on the mechanical aspects of the Ranger that people liked in 3rd edition versus the kind of lore aspect of what the Ranger was. And so they created this version of the Ranger that just didn't work. It no longer got these little piecemeal bonuses, because piecemeal bonuses don't really exist in 5th edition. And bonuses to damage could break things very, very quickly, so they didn't want to do that. So favored enemy got turned into nonsense. The kind of different flavors of Ranger, you could either have a bow Ranger or a 2-weapon fighting Ranger. Well, both of those got hamstringed completely because, again, the fighter's defining feature was their ability to use weapons and make lots of attacks. And so because of that, they got access to every single fighting style. Well, Rangers now no longer had something that made them really special. Fighters could be better archers than they could, and fighters could be better 2-weapon fighters than they could. And there really wasn't a good defining feature built into the Ranger, because the defining features previously were all these little piecemeal things that don't really work in 5th edition. Had they decided to focus on the lore of the Ranger to create the Ranger class instead of the mechanics from 3rd edition that just don't work in 5th edition, I think the Ranger could have been really cool. And they eventually started doing that. When you look at later subclasses and the Tasha fixes to the Ranger, they finally started understanding that no, we need to make the Ranger unique. We need to find that defining feature that no other class gets. And they really started heavily leaning into the kind of partner aspect of the Ranger. They redid the Beastmaster so that your Beast Companion is actually useful. And then you had a bunch of other flavors of Ranger that would get some sort of a companion. You had the Drake Warden, which got a little dragon. You got the Swarm Keeper, which I think actually got a little swarm. Yeah, got a little swarm. So you had those kind of flavors of Rangers. And then you started getting things like Gloomstalker and Horizon Walker, which were more about the kind of hunting aspect of the Ranger. And they would get really cool aspects that would allow them to either get places that you normally couldn't, or be able to kind of focus fire enemies down really powerfully. Things like that. So going back to the idea of 5th edition class design, what I think they were referring to with the thing of, hey, I don't think, we should have launched 5th edition with so many classes, was they spread themselves out really thin and they really didn't kind of understand what they were doing. And when you base everything on these kind of, again, defining features, they really didn't leave a lot of room for homebrewers and things like that to kind of create their own stuff. The stuff was already there, and if you were going to be mixing homebrew with regular D&D stuff, you were going to be running into some issues just because you'd have overlap in that. Again, when I first started publishing for the DMs Guild, I would follow everybody, a bunch of different creators on the DMs Guild, and see the new classes and stuff like that. And most of them were just god awful. New subclasses could be kind of interesting, but most of the new classes that I found were like, there was one that was called, I think it's called the Pugilist, and it was literally just, this is a barbarian and a monk combined. And it was so incredibly overpowered and completely unbalancing at the regular classes, because they basically got most of the good stuff from the barbarian and then most of the good stuff from the monk to turn it into this uber powerful unarmed fighter that had massively high AC, a super high hit point pool, and got resistance from rage and stuff like that. Like, they were unstoppable. So I think that's what they were referring to, is the idea that the original Player's Handbook just had too many different classes, and if they'd held off and maybe just launched with like 9 or 8 classes, and then the remaining 4 that didn't show in that book could have shown up in a later supplement, one of those being the Ranger, probably. Another one, like the Druid, was not super great at first, to the point where 90% of people that played Druids just did Circle the Moon Druids, because Moon Druids were kind of broken at low levels. So I think they probably could have held off on the Ranger, the Druid, the Monk. As much as I love the Monk, could have used a little bit more love. And then I don't know what the fourth one would have been. That was a little bit different, but at least those 3 they probably could have kept off. Yeah, they could have 9 in the core book, and then those 3 they could have held off and worked a little bit harder to create some new defining features that felt good for them. So yeah, I somewhat think that they might try and do that with the new Player's Handbook that's coming out this summer for 5.5. I'm thinking they might, and this is a big might, they might try to avoid updating a couple of the classes until a new supplement or something like that. Though with all the playtesting that they've done, they may have everything there already. Who knows? But yeah, like I said, it's something that I don't see a lot of D&D creators talk about, mostly because most D&D creators just want to shit on D&D right now. But it was a really good game design decision to make, that your classes are not just like some flavor or lore. They're not a collection of abilities. They are distinct ways to play the game, and each class has to introduce a different way to play the game. And I think they did it really, really well. It's one of the reasons why 5th edition D&D is as popular as it is because that game design decision was a good one. And especially now, 10 years later, they executed it really well. When you look at, as long as you're not trying to like tier list them, when you look at all of the classes, like every single class has at least one subclass that's really, really fun to play. Most of them have at least 3 or 4. And there's a few, like, there's quite a few different fighter subclasses that are really, really fun to play. And then when you look at all the different subclasses for everything, there's really not that many subclasses where you're like, you know what, this is just bad. What was it? There was a dwarven-based barbarians as a subclass where you got a special set of armor that you wore as them. My lord, That one's not great. The Sun Soul Monk is not fantastic. Way of Long Death Monk is okay. It's not great. The Elemental Monk sucks. Um, the Hunter Ranger was pretty bland for a while, and they eventually, what was it? The Monster Slayer Ranger is basically an upgraded version of the Hunter Ranger. And then obviously the Beastmaster Ranger sucked. When you look at most of the cleric subclasses have aspects that are really, really interesting. Again, almost all the wizard ones as well. Sorcerer had some really, really cool, interesting ones. Probably the most quote unquote boring sorcerer subclass is the dragon sorcerer, and that's just because it's intentionally designed to be a very simple subclass. There's not a you get some damage resistances built into it, and that's really about it. And you get some kind of draconic things as you level up, but it's nowhere near as complicated as something like the wild magic sorcerer, or the storm sorcerer, or the shadow sorcerer. So yeah, I think overall 5th edition has done a really good job at creating interesting subclasses that fit within this class structure of each class is just a different way to play. And if that way to play already exists, then you don't need a new class. Turn it into a subclass, or even sometimes just a feat that other classes can take to kind of augment how they play. So anyway, like I said, it was something that I thought was really interesting. And again, it's a game design aspect that I haven't heard a ton of people to talk about, because again, I don't think a lot of people really understood. Again, based on how D&D has always worked before, you always had, well, this is the arcane version of this class, or this is the armorless version of this class, or something like that. Those always existed all the way back to 1st edition AD&D. And 5th edition wanted to get rid of that. They didn't want like 3 different versions of the same class that were just kind of flavored slightly differently. They wanted all fighters to play a certain way. So yeah. Anyway, that's gonna be all for me today. I hope you guys find this interesting. Let me know what you guys think about 5th edition class design. The idea that each class is a different way to play. And let me know if you guys know of any cool homebrews that really changed, like actually introduced a different way to play. Because both of mine did. The Dragon Knight has a transformation aspect that doesn't exist in any of the other ones, and the Blood Knight has this ability to basically drain fuel their powers by hitting enemies. So neither of those mechanics exist in the game before I put them in. So I think I did a pretty damn good job. Anyway, it's all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.